Okay, it looks like it's time to get started. Thank you everyone for joining our live lecture today. My name is Isaac and I'll be the lead instructor for the lecture. And today's topic will be Front-End Foundations Part 1. So what that means is this lecture will cover the first half of the Front-End Foundations curriculum. So if you have, or you're in that section, this is the lecture for you. Another thing to mention, couple of things to mention before we start this lecture is that we're going to be opening the floor periodically throughout the lecture, open floor for questions. So if you do have those come up along the way, just make sure you wait until those designated times to ask them. And another thing to mention is that we're recording this lecture. So once we're done here, it'll be posted on our YouTube channel, and that link will be made available to you in your student announcements. So that being said, let's go ahead and discuss what technologies we're going to be going over today. Okay, and today we're going to actually be doing a bit of review. So we're going to be going over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And by now you should be introduced to all these technologies, at least on a basic level. And we're just going to be reviewing what you've been introduced to. Okay, so let's start with HTML and do a brief recap on this. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And in a nutshell, it allows us to create the structure of our page, okay, like the skeleton. Okay, and then we have CSS, and this stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And this allows us to add styling to our page, right? Like all the colors you see here and different fonts and that kind of stuff. That's all CSS. Okay, and then finally we have JavaScript. And JavaScript's responsible for all of our page interactions. So like when I click a button, any animations, right? That's all JavaScript. Okay, so to get started, let's create a base project on our desktop. Okay, so I'll just open up my command line, change directories onto my desktop, and then I'll make a new directory, and I'll call this directory Front-End Foundations, and then we'll go ahead and we'll open up that directory inside of our text editor. Okay, so we just gotta give that a minute to boot on up. Okay, first things first, we need to create an HTML document. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's do that right in our root directory, and we'll call it index.html. Okay, and then within our index.html document, let's go ahead and create an HTML skeleton. Okay, so I'm going to say HTML for the parent element, and then get the head. Inside the head, I'll put a title. The title we'll go ahead and call Front-End Foundations. And next, we'll put a body right below the title. This can be all of our visible content. So let's just put a little hello world message there. Okay, so to test this out, we can copy the path of the index here. And then we'll go ahead and we'll just drop it right in the browser bar. And as we can see, it's rendering the content. Okay, so let's go ahead and inspect and then go to network. And that way we can see our scripts and documents all loading in. Okay, so now we've got a basic HTML doc working. Let's go over some of the more common HTML body elements. Okay, so let's start with headers. Okay, so if we were writing maybe an article or something, we probably want some text that's like the subject line of the article. It's a little bigger, more emphasized. And so to do this, we could use a header. And headers come in 6 different formats. Okay, so you can do H1 through H6, and H1 by default is the largest size, and then it slowly decrements down to a smaller size. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start by saying hello world with an H1. Okay, and actually let's make this the name of the article. So we'll say maybe it's how to code. Okay, so we'll save all. And we refresh, we can see that we get this text with a lot of emphasis as a default font size, right? And so what we can do from here is if we change this to H6, we can see that while it's still emphasized, right, it's much smaller, right? And so depending on the kind of text you need, right? If we look at one of these pages, right, you've got all sorts of different text sizes, right? These are probably headers right here, right, to emphasize the text below. Okay, so that's why we would use a header to draw that attention. Okay, so let's just put it back in H1. We'll say how to code, and then let's go ahead and put just the raw text below it, and that's like similar to what we would see here and here, right? So this is all like paragraph text, okay? And to create that, we could use a paragraph element. Okay, so I'm just going to use a P to do that. And then we can throw in some placeholder text. So I'll just do maybe lorem ipsum, and we'll go ahead and we'll create, you know, just a simple placeholder paragraph here. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh. Okay, and now we can see we're getting, you know, smaller text, right? That's more appropriate for something like, you know, text of an article, right? Something to that nature. So next, let's learn how we can add lists to our article. Okay, say we need to list some stuff off. You need to learn to know how to code. Okay, and so there's two kinds of lists we can create with HTML. We can create an ordered list or an unordered list. Okay, so ordered list simply means that there will be a numeric value next to each of our list items, whereas an unordered list means there will be bullet points. So we'll start out by creating an ordered list, and how we do this is we create a parent element, OL, and then from here we can create several list items and nest them in as children. So the first list item, I'll go ahead and say learn HTML, okay, and then we'll create two more list items. And the second list item will say learn CSS. Third list item will say learn JavaScript. Okay, so we save all and we refresh. Okay, as we can see, it automatically creates this list, right? Even indents it, something we're used to seeing on like a word processor program, right? And so as you notice, I didn't have to hard code these numbers. It just increments them according to their list item position. Okay, so in that same way, I could create an unordered list and simply reference bullet points instead of numerical values. Okay, so we can save all and we refresh. As we can see, now we have, you know, the bullet points. And so, you know, depending on what you need, you might want, you know, bullet points, or you might want, you know, actual numbers. It's really kind of a preference thing depending on your particular situation. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about some other common body elements. So next is a form, okay? So form element allows us to nest child elements like buttons and inputs, right, for submitting and taking in user data. So let's say at the bottom here, we'll have an H3 for contact us, and then we'll go ahead and put a form element below that. Okay, and within this form element, let's go ahead and let's put an input, the type of text, and we'll put a placeholder here for the email of the person contacting us, and then we can go ahead and put a button to submit that information. Okay, so we save all and we refresh. Okay, and now as you can see, we have a nice little form down here for you know, contacting the person. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and let's wrap up the topic of HTML with the anchor element. Okay, so an anchor element is going to allow us to navigate to other web pages. Okay, so for example, let's say we wanted to navigate to this CSS page from our, you know, front-end foundations page. Well, we can do this with an anchor tag. Okay, so we just use A, and then we use this attribute called href to reference the web page we want to navigate to. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and say go to CSS docs. Okay, and then we save all and we refresh. We can see we got, you know, got this hyperlink down here, and when we click on it, we can see that it actually sends us to that web page. Okay, and so just like we can navigate to these third-party web pages, we can also use the anchor tag to navigate to our own internal web pages. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new web page. We'll call it About HTML. And within About HTML, we can go ahead and we can set up a basic HTML skeleton with a head and a title. For the title, we'll just put About. And then for the body, let's just go ahead and we'll put header tag. We'll say hello from about page. Okay, And then back on our index, instead of referencing, this third-party web page, I can just say about.html. And then I will say about us for the link. Okay, so next we can go ahead and save all, and we can refresh. Okay, and we can see when we click about us, it navigates us to our own internal web page. Okay, so moving on, let's go ahead and let's talk about CSS now. Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning, CSS is going to be responsible for setting up the styling, right? The cosmetics, the colors, all that kind of stuff. So to start off, let's create a CSS file we can put all of our styles in. Okay, I'm going to do that right in the root directory, and I'll call it styles.css. Okay, and now what I need to do is within my index doc, I need a reference styles CSS, so when this doc loads in, it will also load in the styles. Okay, so how I'm going to do this is right below the title here, I'm going to put a link referencing styles CSS. Okay, so now I can save all, and if we look here in our network and refresh, you can see it's loading in the style sheet as well as the document. Okay, so now, because CSS, just like HTML, is native to the browser, I can go ahead and I can just start applying styles to various elements. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's erase our little article here. And let's say we have a single header element. We'll just say hello world. And we want to change the style of this element, right? Let's say we want to change the color to red. Okay, so if we just have one element we want to change styles for, then we use what's called an ID selector. Okay, and CSS has several different kinds of selectors, but this selector is meant for styling one individual element. Okay, so look, we'll start by assigning it an ID, and we'll call it greeting. Then in our style sheet, we can reference the greeting ID by saying hashtag greeting. And then between these brackets, we can put our styles. Okay, and so for instance, if I want to change the color red, I'll put color red. And now all elements with the greeting, which is just this one here, will be converted to red color. Okay, so we save all and we refresh. And we can see that is change it from the default browser black to red. Okay, so that's in the case we want to target one element. But sometimes we're going to have a couple elements that maybe have the same element type, but we can't use the same ID for both of these, okay? And if we use maybe greeting 1, greeting 2, we would be really repeating ourselves in the style sheet. So to avoid this, we can just target the element by its type instead of by an individual ID. So back in our style sheet, if we wanted to change the color for all of those header elements, we could say H1, and I could say color blue. Okay, and from here, we could save all, and when we refresh our browser, we can see that because these are the same element type, right? It targets all the elements with the H1 type and applies this style. Okay, so now we know how to target elements of the same type. Let's explore, well, what would happen if we had two elements of different types? Okay, well, now we're in the same situation as before where we can't assign different IDs to these because we'll just be repeating ourselves in the style sheet here. Okay, so instead, to target groups of elements that have different element types, we use a class selector. Okay, and so we'll just call this class color red. Okay, and then we'll assign the same exact class to this H2 element. Okay, so now we can go to our style sheet and we can reference that class. Okay, so we'll say color red by using this dot here, and then we'll apply the color red. Okay, so now all elements with that class will receive that style. Okay, so we save all, we refresh. We can see that regardless of the element type, it's receiving the same style because they're all grouped together according to this class. Okay, so those are the three most common static selectors in CSS. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about a pseudo selector. And the difference between a static selector and a pseudo selector is a pseudo selector only will apply a style when a specific browser event is happening. So for example, I'm sure you've been to web pages where you'll use your mouse to hover over a particular part of the page and maybe it'll light up or emphasize certain text in bold, whatever else. And that's what's considered a pseudo selector, is it only applies the style when the hover event, say, is taking place. So let's go ahead and use that same scenario inside our application here. And let's make it to where when we hover over this element here, we then will apply the color red. Otherwise, we will just not apply a style at all. Okay, so how I could set up the pseudo selector is I could simply target the greeting element, then I could use a colon, I could say hover, and now it will only apply the style if I'm hovering over that particular element. Okay, so we save all and we refresh. You can see it starts off black, but as soon as I hover over it, the pseudo selector applies the style. Okay, and so this is one of many pseudo selectors. There's several you can use for different kinds of browser events. So feel free to explore the docs more if you're curious about those. So last kind of selector we're going to talk about is a nested selector. Okay, so nested selector is a way for us to style child elements without having to style the parent element itself. Okay, because within CSS, we have the concept of cascading, which means if we style a parent element, right, those styles will be immediately inherited by the children elements, right? So to get around that, we can use nested selectors. So to best explore this, let's go ahead and let's create a form. And within this form, let's have an input, and as well as an input, let's have a button. And let's style both of these children element, but let's not style the actual form element itself. Okay, and we can do this with nested selectors. We'll start off by styling the input, and we'll say form input, and then from here I can go ahead and give it a style. So I'll just say background color, and I will say yellow. Okay, and then style the button, I could use the same approach. Okay, so I just say form space button, and then maybe I'll just change the color of the button to red. Okay, so to test this out, we could save all. When we refresh, we can see that we're not actually applying any styles to the form, right? The parent element itself. We're actually using these nested selectors to target the children elements and apply styles to those only. Okay, so moving on from the topic of selectors, let's talk about the CSS box model. Okay, so every element has a box model. Okay, and you can envision it as the spacing around the specific element itself. So let's go ahead and erase our form here. Let's create a greeting element. Okay, and then we'll give it an ID equal to greeting. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply the 3 layers of the box model to this element. Okay, and those are padding, border, and margin. Okay, and so padding is going to be basically the space on the inside of the box. Okay, and then you got border, which is the space between the inside and the outside spacing, and then you got margin, which is the space on the outside of the box. Okay, so let's apply all 3 of those by starting out and saying hashtag greeting. Okay, and we'll start with padding. And how this works is we have to account for all 4 sides of the box. Okay, so we'll just basically pass in the pixel range for each side. So I'm just going to say 10 pixels for each side in the padding. And then the border, we have to specify a thickness as well as a pattern. Is it dotted, dashed, solid, and then we also have to specify the color. Okay, and finally, for the margin, it's the same approach as the padding because it's 4 sides, right? This is just the spacing on the outside of the box versus the spacing on the inside. Okay, so for this, I'm going to put 50 pixels on each side. Okay, so from here, we can save all, and we refresh. And as we can see, we get a nicely positioned element. Okay, so to truly see what's going on under the hood, we can inspect it. And as you notice, the parts of the box model light up. Okay, so here we've got the actual core element with just its height and width. And then the padding is the spacing on the inside, right? That's the 10 pixels on each side. The borders is spacing between the inside and outside, and the margin is the spacing on the outside. okay? So depending on your specific design needs, you can position your elements, a little bit this way, a little bit that way, using, the box model here to create a real nice looking web page. Okay, so moving on, next let's talk about font family. Okay, so with our element, using CSS, we have the ability to change the font family. Okay, and there's a bunch of built-in fonts that we can use, such as the ones listed here. Okay, and the browser just knows them natively. Okay, so let's just use, for example, monospace. Okay, so we save all and we refresh. We can see that it's now given this element a different font family, right? And so while that works, these built-in fonts are kind of limited, and they don't always work with the particular design theme that we're using to build the web page. Okay, so if that's the case, we can use a custom font. Okay, and there are several custom font providers, but the most used and free version is Google Fonts. Okay, so let's go to Google Fonts, and then as you can see, they just present you with a bunch of different fonts, that you can use. And let's just say I find one I like. Let's say, maybe this one. We like this lobster one. Okay, so we can start by seeing the specimen. This allows us to check out the entire alphabet, all the casing, make sure this is really what we want. The performance, all that good times, and then we can go ahead and we can use the standard embed method by copying the link and heading back to our index and then loading it right above our custom style sheet here. Okay, so now you can see that it just says we need to reference the font family lobster. Okay, so as well as referencing the main font family, we can reference a secondary font family. This is just a backup in case this one fails to load. We can go ahead and display a font family that does exist. Okay, so we save all and we refresh, and as we can see, we're getting a nice custom font applied to our element. Okay, and yeah, that's how we can use font family with CSS. Okay, so let's wrap up CSS with the topic of media queries. Okay, so media queries are ways that we can set logistical expressions, and if they evaluate to true, we can then apply styles to specific elements. And this is really great for responsive web design because there's often times where you need to watch, say, the device, the width of the device. And if it changes from large to small, you need to then change specific element styling. Okay, and so this is what we're going to be using media queries today. Is when the device gets to a specific pixel width, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply a different style. Okay, so to see this in action, we start off by saying media, and then we pass in an expression. Okay, and in my case, I'm going to say the min width of the screen needs to be 800 pixels. And if it is 800 pixels, then we're going to target the greeting element, and we're going to change the font size to 15 pixels. Okay, so let's go ahead and save all, and let's see our media query in action. Okay, so we refresh. We can see that because it reaches the min width, it applies that font size. Okay, but as soon as it's no longer 800 pixels, right, and that's no longer evaluating to true, then it does not apply that style. Okay, and as you can see, we now have a responsive web page depending on screen width. Okay, and we're not just limited to this one rule here. Where there's actually several different things we can use and evaluate. Although I must say that screen width is definitely the most common thing you'll run into. So if we want to, we could even change this like so, right? We could refresh, and now it's going to be the opposite to where, whenever we go under, it will apply that style, right? So that is a pretty good review of HTML and CSS. So let's go and open the floor. Let's see if anyone has any questions before we move on to JavaScript. Okay, so floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask those now. Okay, I don't hear one, so let's go ahead and continue. So as we mentioned at the beginning, JavaScript is a way that we can add interactions to our web page, right? When a button is clicked, we can run functionality based on that event, right? So to get started, we need to add a script file, okay? And so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna close out my style sheet, and then I'm gonna go to my root directory, and I'm gonna create a script file, and we'll go ahead and we'll call this one app.js. And so from here, I need to reference the script file just kind of like I did with my style sheet here. Okay, so to keep them separated, I'm just going to go ahead and throw a little note down here for app scripts. And then we can throw in a script with a source pointing to app.js. Okay, so from here, if we save all, we can go to our network and we can refresh. We can see that not only is it loading in our document, our style sheet, but as well it's also loading in our script. Okay, and JavaScript is also native to the browser, just like HTML and CSS is. So this will, the code in here will immediately execute. Okay, so that being said, let's go ahead and head over to our app.js, and let's start off by discussing JavaScript variables. Okay, and so a JavaScript variable, simply put, is a storage container for a set value in browser memory. Okay, so there's a couple ways there's a couple different approaches that we can use to create JavaScript variables. Okay, and so the first and most common approach is to use a keyword called var. Okay, so if I say var, then I can declare the name of the variable, which is normally intuitive to what data it's storing. So let's say I'm going to store some text with my name. So I'll call the variable my name. And as you notice, I make sure to use camel case by convention. And then from here, I use an equal sign to assign the variable a value. Okay, and so from here, I can assign it many different data types. But the most common you'll probably run into is called a string. Okay, and a string is simply some text between a pair of quotes. Okay, so I'll just put Isaac between a pair of quotes, and now that will format on the browser as a string. Okay, so from here we can use a tool called console log to evaluate the value of the my name variable when the browser loads. Okay, so let's save all. Let's go to the console here and refresh. We can see that we're getting Isaac printed out to the console, right? That's because that's the value of the variable. So that being said, there's another approach we can use using what's called the let keyword instead of var. Okay, and so let's go ahead and save all, and let's refresh. Okay, and as you can see, we're getting the same exact result. So you might be asking yourself, well, what's the big difference between var and let? Okay, and simply put, let uses what's called block scope, and var does not. And we'll get into a little bit more what that means when we talk about functions here in a minute. Okay, but for now, just know that the way we assign variables is pretty much the same. And these variables also have a dynamic nature to them, meaning they can be changed after creation. So if I want to, on second line here, I could say my name equals Joe, and then I could console log the value of my name. And because the script is read from top to bottom, it's going to load in, the value of my name as Isaac, but then it's going to reassign it to the value of Joe. Because that's the last thing that was assigned to in memory, that's what we'll print out to the console. So let's save all, and when we refresh, we can see we're getting Joe printed out. Okay, and so that's in situations we would want to change it, right? If we have maybe a number we're incrementing or something of that nature, it's great to have the ability to change a variable. However, there's going to be some situations where we don't want a variable to change. We don't want it to be overwritten in any way, because it's very important. So let's say a company name, for example. We know that company name will probably never change. So that being said, we want to create a variable where it can't be overwritten by, say, another developer working on the same code. Okay, so to do this, we use what's called a constant. Okay, so the keyword for that is const, and then we declare the name of the variable. We'll call it company name, and then we'll just call this Isaac's company. Okay, And then from here, if we go ahead and we try to reassign this variable to other company, well, the browser is now going to give us an error because we're basically breaking the rules here. You're not allowed to reassign the value of a constant after it's created, okay? And which is good. We don't want that to be able to change. So we refresh, and we can see that we get an error, right? And it's letting us know that's assigned to a constant variable. So now it's locked in and safe. Alrighty, so next, let's go ahead and let's explore some other JavaScript data types, okay? So we've already seen a string in action, right? And again, that's just some text between pair of quotes, okay? But another common data type is a number, okay? And unlike a string, with a number, we can actually perform arithmetic operations. So for example, if I create a variable, we'll call it my name, or not my name, I'm sorry. Let's say my age, and we'll make it equal to 99. And then we can create another variable called next year's age. We can make it equal to my age plus 1. And then we could console log the value of next year's age. Okay, and so we file, save all, refresh. We can see that we're getting the calculated result of 99 plus 1, right? And so that's the advantage of using a number value, right? Because we can actually perform these operations. Whereas if maybe this was a string here, right? My age was a string, and I tried to perform the same operation. Well, we can see that it doesn't actually perform the arithmetic, right? It just adds 1 to the end of this. So it's basically, you know, just not accurate. Okay, so to avoid that, we actually use a real number type, and as you can see, I don't pass a pair of quotes around it. All right. Another common data type in JavaScript let's go over is a Boolean. Okay, and so a Boolean is one of two values. It's either true or false, and that's all it can ever be. Okay, so let's create a variable. We'll call it concode. I'll go ahead and put true for that, and we can console log the value of concode. Okay, and we'll save all, and when we refresh, we can see evaluates to true. Okay, so let's go ahead and change the name of the variable. We'll say convance, and we'll put false. And from here, if we save and refresh, we can see that we're getting false. Okay, so you might ask yourself, okay, well, what's the use of that, right? Having true. And really, it goes back to the very foundation of how computers think in ones and zeros or binary, okay? And so with ones and zeros, that simply represent true or false, okay? And this is where Boolean comes into play, is when we're trying to tell the computer make decisions, oftentimes it needs to evaluate specific things going on in order to make that decision, okay? And this is where Boolean comes into play, because we can say, if true, do this, if false, do this, right? And so that is how we can use that. Another data type we'll talk about is an object, okay? So an object is where we can store several key value pairs within a single variable value instead of having to create, you know, single entities each time. Okay, so for example, if we were to create a program without objects, this is you know, the approach of how it would look. We would say let user1 name equals let's say Joe, and let user2 name equals Jack. Okay, and then if we want to add more information, we would have to do something like user1 age equals 99, let user2 age equals 100, right? And so just with two users, this is getting out of hand really quickly. I'm really repeating myself, right? It's very repetitious. It's not very organized, right? The user's information is all jumbled together. And so to avoid this kind of situation, we can use an object instead to wrap up all the information for each user into a single entity. Okay, so how I can do this, I'll go ahead and start with the user1. I'll make it equal to a pair of curly brackets, and then I just pass in my key value pairs. And so a key value pair would be something like this: name, colon, Joe. Okay, and then I could pass in more key value pairs by separating that with a comma. So maybe I'll give them age, 99. Okay, so as you can see, all the information is now wrapped under one variable instead of two. Okay, so we can use the same approach for user 2. Let's say name equals Jack and age equals 100. Okay, so from here, let's go ahead and let's console log the value of user 1. So we save all and we refresh, and we can see that we're getting the object, right? An age and a name. Okay, so now comes the question, well, how can we access the values inside this object? Okay, and we can use one of two approaches. The first approach, and most common, is called dot notation. So how it works is that we reference the object, and then we put a dot, and then we reference the property in which we want the value for. So if I want the name of user 1, I'm going to have to say user1.name. Okay, so we save all, and when we refresh, you can see that we're getting Joe. Okay, instead of the entire object return, we're only getting that value. Okay, and so the second approach to accessing object values is to use bracket notation. Okay, so how this works is maybe if I wanted user 2's age, I would say user 2 square brackets age. Okay, so from here we could save all, we can refresh. As you can see, it only returns the age. Okay, and so one last data type we'll talk about is an array. Okay, an array really is just an object that uses index positioning instead of these custom key value pairs. Okay, and typically you're going to see this in situations where we have multiple values in a single collection. Okay, so let's say we have a list of friends, and so we could say friends equals an array. An array is represented by square brackets, and then instead of passing key value pairs, we simply pass in single values. So I'll say Jack, Joe, Jane, and Jill. Okay, so now we can console log the value of friends and print it out to our browser. Okay, so as we can see, we pass them in as single entities, and then each element in the array is represented by an index position, and that's how we can access that individual value. So let's go ahead and try that by accessing Jack by saying friends at the index of 0. So we refresh, we can see that it only returns the value from the array instead of the entire array itself. Okay, and we can do same thing if we want maybe Jill instead. She's at the index of 3, right? Because it starts at 0. So we could go ahead and get her value just by referencing different position. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and move on to the topic of JavaScript conditionals. Okay, and so conditional is a way of telling the program to make a decision. Okay, and so the most common conditional you're going to run into is called an if statement. And how an if statement works is like this: we use an if keyword, and then we pass an expression. So I'll just say 10 is greater than 5. And if this expression evaluates true, then it will run this block of code. So I'm just going to go ahead and console log 10 is greater than 5. Okay, so from here, let's go ahead and save all. And if we refresh, we can see that it evaluates that expression. And because it evaluates to true, it runs this code. But now watch what happens if we try to say 10 is greater than 50. Because that evaluates to false, it's going to ignore this code now. So we save all, and when we refresh, we no longer get any console log. Okay, and so for the event that this fails and this evaluates to false, we can use something called an else statement, which will run as a secondary condition. Okay, so I can throw an else here, and then I can console log none of the above. Okay, so now if we save all, it's going to execute the else statement because this evaluates the false. Okay, and as we can see, we get that execution just as expected. Okay, so now if we want to evaluate more than one expression, we can use what's called an else if statement. Okay, and so else if works, I just pass in right after the initial if statement, and then I'll just pass in more expressions. So I'll say if 10, well, let's try if 4 is greater than 3. Okay, because we know that's true, we'll go ahead and we will console log 4 is greater than 3. Okay, and then finally, if none of those evaluates true, we'll go ahead and we'll console log none of the above. So we save all and we refresh. We can see that it lets us know 4 is greater than 3, right? So it evaluates this expression. Because it evaluates false, it ignores this block of code. It evaluates this expression. Because this evaluates a true, it runs this block of code, and it ignores this block of code. Okay, so finally, if we were to change this to 4 is greater than 30, it's going to keep evaluating each else if expression until it finds one that's true. And if it can't, it'll simply run the last else statement. Okay, so let's go ahead and test that out. Refresh our browser. And we can see that because none of them evaluated true, it ran this last condition. Okay, and yeah, that's how we can set up decision making with our program. Okay, next, let's talk about JavaScript loops. Okay, so oftentimes on client side, we're dealing with large amounts of data which we have an unknown length. Okay, and so if data has an unknown length, that means we can't use index positioning to target the data we need. Therefore, we use what's called a loop, and a loop allows us to iterate through that data, and for each element in the array, we can perform a specific functionality. Okay, so the most common kind of loop you're going to run into is a for loop. And a for loop is meant to iterate through an array. Okay, so let's start off by creating an array, and let's just create an array of friends. And the idea here is we'll have a bunch of different friends. We just, let's say we don't know the how do you say it? The quantity of this array. Okay, we'll just say it's a random amount. Okay, so we have a bunch of different friends in there now, and let's say we want to greet each one, but we don't know how many friends we have. And this is where a for loop comes into play. Okay, so we use the for keyword, and then we declare a variable I equal to 0. That's basically telling the loop to start at the index of 0, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to keep the loop running as long as I is less than friends dot length, and then we're going to increment I one each loop. Okay, and so now we can simply throw in a console log, and we can say hello plus friends at the index of I. Okay, and because I starts off at 0, friends at the index of 0 is Joe, so it's going to say hello Joe. It's going to go to the next loop. On the next loop, I will be 1. So friends at the index of 1 is Jack. He'll say hello, Jack, and it'll just keep going on until I is no longer less than friends dot length. I is no longer less than friends dot length. Sorry. Okay, so to test this out, let's save all and refresh our browser. And as we can see, it iterates through that collection and greets each one of our friends. Okay, and again, the great part about the loop is it doesn't care how many friends we have, right? It'll adjust based on that number. So let's just add a couple more here. Let's say we have Jenny, Jake, and John. Okay, and so we'll notice it'll immediately adjust and compensate for those new friends now. Okay, so we refresh. We can see that with the loop, we can just have confidence to greet them all. Okay, so next let's talk about JavaScript functions. Okay, and JavaScript functions are executable, repeatable blocks of code we can use within our program. Okay, and so there's two main approaches to creating JavaScript functions. You've got function statements and function expressions. So let's start by going over a function statement. Excuse me. Okay, so to start a function statement, we use the keyword function, and then we pass in the name of the function, which is normally intuitive to what the function is doing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a function called sayName. And from here, we can go ahead and we can activate this function, or what's more commonly referred to as invoke this function, by referencing the name and then passing in any arguments. Okay, so in my case, I'll pass in Joe, and we'll greet Joe. Okay, and so now I can populate this field with what's called a parameter. And this parameter is just a representational value. Okay, so I'm just going to put n, and that will represent name. And then I'm going to console log hello, and then we'll go ahead and we will pass in the value of the name. Okay, so now we can save all. And when we refresh, we can see that it says hello, Joe. Okay, so that's a function statement. A function expression is simply when we have a variable which is equal to a function. Okay, and so let's just pass in, maybe a different name here, save all, and when we refresh, we can see we get the exact same result. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, okay, so what's the big difference between a function statement and function expression? Okay, and there's two kind of underlying differences. The first one being, because the function expression is technically a variable, we have the ability to pass it off to other functions in callback situations. The other difference is, because a function expression is a variable, that means it must be declared before it's invoked, unlike a function statement, which doesn't matter. So to test this out, if we were to say, take this invocation and move it above the declaration, well, now our browser is going to throw an error saying this isn't defined because it never had a chance to load in. Okay, and there it is, just as expected. Okay, so with the function statement, this is not the case. The function statement, we can simply reference the function above or below, and it will work either way. It'll just look for that function in the code. And so we refresh now, we can see that we get the clean function execution. Okay, so next let's talk about an object method. Okay, and so an object method is very similar to a function, except it is a function that is the value of an object property instead. Okay, so let's say I had a person object, and on this person object, instead of just hard coding a name, I can create a method which will turn the value of the name. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say return Isaac. Okay, and so now to invoke this method, we can simply console log person dot name invoke. And because it returns a string, that's what will be printed out. So we save all, we refresh, we can see that we're getting our name printed out. And that's because the function was invoked using dot notation reference there. Okay, and so moving right along, let's talk about JavaScript scope. Okay, and so scope is basically the accessibility of variables within functions in our program. Okay, and so there's a couple different kinds of scopes, and so the first kind of scope we're going to talk about is global scope. So to create global scope, we need to create a variable that's outside of any function or conditional, any declaration at all. Okay, so I'm going to just do it right at the top here. I'll create a variable called counter, and we'll make it equal to 0. Okay, so that's global. That means I can access this inside or outside of a function. So I'll just go ahead and throw in a simple console log here. We'll console log the value of counter. And then we'll go ahead and throw a function statement in here called increment. And the idea behind this function is we'll take the value of counter and we'll add 1. And then we'll console log that new value. And as you notice, I'm console logging counter both outside the function and inside the function. And that's why they call it global, because it's globally accessible everywhere. Okay, so now let's just link this increment function to a button click event. Okay, so in my index here, I'm going to get rid of my header, throw a button in. We'll say increment, and then for the on click, I'll go ahead and reference the increment function. Okay, so from here we save all and we refresh our browser. Okay, so when we click increment now, you notice that it loaded in at 0, right? That was the first console log we saw. This one right here. And then once I click the button, it added 1 to that 0 and printed it out. Okay, and so now in memory, each time I click increment, it keeps adding 1 to that in memory. okay? And again, that's referenced as global scope. Now, if I was to take this declaration here and I was to move it inside of this function, well, now that's going to be considered function scope, not global scope, okay? And so what function scope means is the counter variable only exists within the scope of this function now, okay? So if I try to console log counter outside the function now, I'm going to get an error because it only exists inside the function. So if we save all and we refresh, we can see we get this error, right? Because counter is not technically defined outside the function. Okay, so next, if we save all, because this is in the function scope now, it's going to reset counter to 0 each time and then increment it to 1. Meaning we're never actually going to get past the number 1 now, no matter how many times we click it. Okay, so let's head back to our browser, refresh, and we can see that no matter how many times we click it now, it's always going to reset to 0 and increment to 1. Okay, and that again is what's referenced as the function scope. So last kind of scope we're going to talk about is block scope. And block scope is very much the difference between the var and let keywords. Okay, remember that let uses block scope and var does not. So let's start off by creating a function. Let's call this function scope test. And in this function, let's start off by using the var keyword, equal before, and then we'll have a conditional running here. Within this block, we'll go ahead and declare a variable x equal to 1. And within that block, we'll console log the value of x, okay? And then within this block, we'll go ahead and console log the value of x, okay? And then finally, we will invoke the function down here. So because var does not use block scope, what's going to happen is it's going to overwrite this x to 1, okay? And that's because x was declared as 1, last thing in memory here, right? So this scope overrides this scope, which is bad. We don't want that to happen, but using the var keyword, that's what will happen, okay? So let's see in action. So we refresh here. You can see we're getting 1 and 1. Again, it's bad, right? It's taking this and overwriting this. So to avoid that, we can use the let keyword. And let implements block scope, which means that these scopes don't talk to each other, right? They can't overwrite each other. So knowing that, we can go ahead and run that same function. And now we can see that we're getting 1 and 4, right? It's keeping those values as is between the different scopes. And that's why we recommend to use let, because it's a little more, improved as far as performance goes. Okay, so let's wrap up JavaScript with the topic of the DOM. Okay, so the DOM is short for Document Object Model. And basically, it's a way that we can create browser events within our program. Okay, so let's just take, for example, we have a button, and when we click the button, we want to throw up an alert, a pop-up. Okay, and so to do this, we could go ahead and let's start off by console logging the document. Okay, and that way we can see what we're working with. Okay, so we'll go ahead and refresh. We can see the document is simply the document, right? It's the HTML nodes, all that good stuff. As we can see in the structure of our page. But to see the document object, we have to say console.dir. Okay, and when we refresh, we can see that now we're viewing all the the various properties and values on the document object. And at the bottom here, you'll notice we have a bunch of built-in browser events, right? On click, on drag, on mouse up, on key up, on key press, right? They pretty much cover all your different browser scenarios. And so the idea is we can use these events to where, when say a button's clicked, we can, run one of these as a callback, right? So let's just take a common one like on click, and let's make it to where when a button's clicked, we'll then run an event. Okay, so let's start off by setting up the button inside our index, okay? And so I'm going to just give it an ID. And this ID will be equal to my button. Okay, and then we can go ahead and we can target that by its ID, and we can add an event listener. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say let my button equals document.getElementById, my button. Okay, so now this variable represents that element node. I can then add an event listener. Okay, and event listener is really just how it sounds, right? It's listening in for a certain browser event. When that event happens, it runs a callback function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say my button dot add event listener. And the event we're listening for is click. And when the click event runs, we're then going to run this callback function here. There we go. Okay, and inside the callback function, we'll go ahead and throw an alert, and we'll say, hello world. Okay, so now we can save all, and we can refresh, and let's go ahead and let's change the context of this button. We'll go ahead and say greet. And one more refresh. And when we click on greet, we can see that using the document object model, we have ran this browser event callback. Okay? And as you saw, there's many other events we can use besides onClick, right? There's onDrag, onKeyPress, all these other ones that you can take advantage of. So feel free to explore those as your curiosity sees fit. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's open up the floor and let's see if anyone has any last questions before we end the lecture today. Okay, so the floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask them now. Okay, it does not appear so. Thanks everyone for stopping by. Have a great day and happy coding out there.